My father-in-law secretly DNA tested my infant son to prove I was cheating. At Sunday dinner, he slid the envelope to my wife with a smile. The results destroyed him, not me. The envelope landed on the table beside the gravy boat at 1:42 p.m. on a Sunday in April, and my father-in-law slid it across the tablecloth with the specific, satisfied calm of a man who has been waiting weeks to do exactly this. "Lena," Walter said, "I think you should open this." In front of everyone, I was holding my 11-month-old son Caleb on my lap, his small fist wrapped around my finger the way it had been since the day he was born, and I watched my wife's hands go still over her plate. "What is it, Dad?" she said. "Open it," he said. "I think your husband should see too." I want to be precise about what happened in my body in that moment, because precision is the only thing that has ever made any of this make sense afterward. I did not feel afraid exactly. I felt the specific, sinking confusion of a man who has done nothing wrong and is watching, in real time, an accusation arrive that he cannot yet name. Lena opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper from a laboratory I'd never heard of, Heritage Genomics Diagnostic Services, with a header that read Paternity Analysis Report, and beneath it, two names, Caleb Thomas Whitfield and Marcus Thomas Whitfield. My name, my son's name. A laboratory result neither of us had ever ordered. "What is this?" I said. Walter's smile had not moved. "Probability of paternity," he said. 99.98%. Confirmed match. The table was quiet for exactly the length of time it takes a room full of people to realize that something they assumed was a setup for a confession has just become a setup for something else entirely. "Dad," Lena said slowly, "how do you have a DNA test for our son?" "I had it run," Walter said, still smiling, still certain. 6 weeks ago, from the hairbrush you left at our house at Easter. I had Marcus's DNA on file from when he donated blood at the company drive 2 years ago. Corporate records, easy enough to access through a friend." He looked at me. "I wanted to know the truth before this family got any more invested in a child who might not even be ours." I sat there holding my son, and I understood, with the specific clarity that arrives about 4 seconds too late in moments like this, that my father-in-law had spent 6 weeks and some unknown amount of money attempting to prove I was not Caleb's father. The test had come back confirming, at a probability of 99.98%, that I was. He had built his entire confrontation, his triumphant envelope slide, his Sunday dinner ambush, around a result he had clearly never bothered to read before staging the reveal. "Walter," I said, "you just publicly announced, in front of your entire family, that you secretly DNA tested my infant son, and the result says I'm his father." The color left his face in stages. "My name is Marcus Whitfield. I'm 34 years old. I'm a structural engineer at a firm in Minneapolis, and 5 years ago I married Lena Brandt, the daughter of Walter and Carol Brandt, a man I had known, by that point in our relationship, for almost 6 years, and who had never once, in all that time, given me any reason to expect what was coming. I need to back up, because the Sunday dinner makes no sense without understanding exactly what Walter is and what he had been building toward for months before that envelope ever existed. Walter Brandt is 66 years old. He spent 31 years as a regional sales director for an industrial equipment manufacturer, and he carried into retirement the particular, unshakable confidence of a man who had spent his entire career being right about things in a room full of people who needed him to be right. He is not unintelligent. He is something more specifically dangerous than that. He is a man who has never once, in my observation, encountered a piece of evidence he couldn't reframe to fit a conclusion he'd already reached. Lena is his only daughter. She has 2 older brothers, Garrett and Theo, both of whom Walter has always regarded with a kind of straightforward, uncomplicated pride. Garrett the one who took over part of his old sales territory. Theo the one who'd gone into commercial lending and talked easily in the specific language of numbers that Walter respected above almost anything else. Lena had gone into pediatric nursing, a career Walter had described more than once at family gatherings as noble, I guess, in a tone that made clear he considered it a noble consolation prize, rather than the genuine achievement it actually was. I had met Lena at a mutual friend's wedding 9 years before the Sunday in question, and I had liked Walter, in the early years, in the specific, uncomplicated way you like the father of someone you're falling in love with, eager to be approved of, willing to overlook the small comments, the offhand remarks about my engineering salary compared to what Theo made in lending, the questions about whether I'd considered something more stable before Lena and I got engaged. What I did not understand in those early years was that Walter's confidence was not actually rooted in information. It was rooted in narrative. He decided, early and often, what a situation meant, and then he built whatever evidence-shaped material was necessary to support the decision he'd already made. The first real sign that something specific was building came about 5 months before that Sunday dinner. Caleb had been born the previous June, and Lena and I had gone through, in the months immediately after, the particular sleep-deprived blur that consumes most new parents: feedings, pediatrician visits, the slow process of learning an entirely new person's specific patterns and needs. At a family barbecue in November, Walter had made a comment, lightly, almost as a joke, about how Caleb didn't really look like either of you, did he? The kind of comment that gets made about babies constantly, usually without malice, usually forgotten within minutes. I hadn't thought much of it. Lena mentioned, weeks later, that her father had asked her, in a separate conversation she hadn't told me about at the time, whether things had been stressful between us in the months before Caleb was conceived, a question with a specific implication buried inside it that she had brushed off as her father simply being intrusive in his usual way. I should have understood, in that exact comment, the shape of what was beginning to form. I didn't yet. I told myself Walter was being Walter. Nosy, a little inappropriate, harmless in the specific way I had spent 9 years convincing myself he was harmless. The second sign came in February, 4 months before the Sunday dinner, when Carol, Lena's mother, a quieter and generally more reasonable presence in the family than Walter, mentioned to Lena, in what she clearly intended as a casual aside, that Walter had been doing some research about something and seemed unusually preoccupied. Research about what? I asked when Lena told me. I don't know, she said. He gets like this sometimes. He'll get fixated on something, and then it'll pass. It did not pass. What I did not know, what neither of us knew, was that Walter had, by that point, already begun the process of obtaining Caleb's DNA without our knowledge or consent. He had taken a hairbrush Lena had left at his house over Easter weekend, the previous month, and mailed a sample to a direct-to-consumer paternity testing laboratory, alongside a sample he'd preserved, apparently for over 2 years, from a corporate blood drive where I had donated to the company's annual blood bank program, a donation record he had accessed, he would later admit, under direct questioning, through a former colleague who still worked in HR at my employer, and who had pulled the donor log as a personal favor without understanding what it would be used for. I want to sit with that fact for a moment, because it is the detail that, more than any other, told me exactly what kind of campaign this had actually been. Walter had not simply acted on a passing suspicion. He had engaged in a multi-month operation involving the unauthorized retrieval of medical donor records from my employer, the covert collection of biological material from his own grandson, and a paid laboratory analysis, all of it conducted entirely in secret, over a period of weeks, building toward a single-staged reveal he intended to deliver in front of the maximum possible audience. What happened over the following hour at that Sunday dinner table, I have to walk through carefully, because the speed of it mattered as much as the content. Walter, Carol said, her voice tight. What did you do? I protected this family, Walter said, though his certainty was already visibly thinning, the way a man's confidence thins when the floor beneath an argument turns out not to be where he left it. I had a feeling. I wanted proof before things went any further. Proof of what, exactly? Lena said. Her voice had gone very quiet, which I had learned over 9 years of marriage was a far more dangerous register than anger. There were signs, Walter said, the way the timing worked out, the way Marcus traveled for work that spring. I wasn't going to just ignore it. You stole my son's DNA, Lena said, from a hairbrush without telling either of us, and you stole my husband's medical donor record from his job, and you ran a paternity test behind our backs, and you brought the results to Sunday dinner to humiliate him in front of your entire family. I brought them, Walter said, to settle the question. The question is settled, I said. It says I'm his father. 99.98%. You had the answer for 6 weeks and you still decided the best use of it was a public ambush. Walter looked at the paper again, as if rereading it might produce a different number. I want to understand something, I said, and I want to note that my voice, when I listened back to the recording Lena's brother Garrett happened to be taking on his phone from across the table, a recording neither of us asked for, but that became later, more useful than either of us expected, stayed level the entire time. You suspected your daughter's husband of cheating, based on nothing more specific than travel for work and a baby who didn't immediately resemble either of his parents, which is true of an enormous number of newborns. And instead of asking either of us directly, you spent weeks and presumably real money secretly obtaining DNA from an infant and a corporate blood donation record, so that you could stage a confrontation at a family dinner. I had a right to know, Walter said. You had a right to ask, I said. You did not have a right to do any of what you actually did. I retained an attorney named Patricia Solano, a family and privacy law specialist with 18 years of practice in Minneapolis, after Lena and I spent 3 sleepless nights trying to understand exactly what legal exposure Walter had created, for himself, and potentially for the laboratory and the former HR colleague who had pulled my donor record. There are several distinct issues here, Patricia said, in our first meeting, laying out the relevant frameworks with the specific clinical calm of someone who has clearly handled stranger things than this. The unauthorized collection and genetic testing of a minor's DNA without parental consent is, in Minnesota, a serious privacy violation, potentially actionable under both state genetic privacy statutes and, depending on how the lab handled consent documentation, federal regulations governing genetic testing services. The unauthorized access and disclosure of your medical donor records is a separate and potentially more serious problem because it likely involved a breach of confidentiality protections that your employer's blood donation program would have been contractually and legally obligated to maintain. What does that mean in practice? I asked. It means, Patricia said, that your father-in-law didn't just behave badly at a family dinner. He may have committed an actual privacy violation against your son, and he definitely induced someone else, the HR employee, to commit one against you. That person's job is very likely at risk, separate from anything Walter himself faces. I had not, until that meeting, fully considered what would happen to the person who had pulled my records. I want to be honest. Some part of me felt a flicker of guilt about that, even though I had done nothing to cause it. Patricia's response to that flicker, when I mentioned it, was direct. The person who accessed your records made a choice, she said, a bad one, with real consequences attached. You didn't create that choice. Walter did by asking for something he had no right to ask for, from someone who should have known better than to provide it. Devon's review, completed over 5 weeks, confirmed that my employer's blood donation program operated under a specific confidentiality agreement with all participating employees, and that the HR coordinator who had pulled my record, a woman named Brittany Lowell, who I had met exactly twice at company events, and who turned out to be a longtime personal friend of Walter's, from a community theater group they'd both belonged to for over a decade, had accessed and disclosed the record in direct violation of that agreement, with no legitimate business justification. Brittany was terminated from her position within 3 weeks of the company's internal investigation concluding. She did not face criminal charges, but the company's legal department, once informed, treated the breach with considerably more seriousness than Walter had apparently anticipated when he asked his old friend for just a quick favor. The DNA testing laboratory, Heritage Genomics, turned out to have a documented history of accepting samples without verifying the legal authority of the person submitting them, a practice that, Devon's report noted, put them in a legally precarious position regarding a string of similar complaints filed in 3 other states over the preceding 2 years. Patricia's formal letter to the lab, outlining the unauthorized collection of a minor's genetic material without parental consent, prompted a response within days. The lab's legal counsel confirmed they would be reviewing their intake procedures and offered, without prompting, to destroy all retained samples and records related to Caleb's test. We accepted. What I want to describe most carefully is what happened to Walter himself, because the consequences he faced were not primarily legal. They were structural, in the specific way that consequences land on people who have spent their entire lives believing their certainty entitled them to act on it without checking first. Carol, Lena's mother, separated from Walter 4 months after that Sunday dinner. Not because of any single dramatic confrontation, but because, as she told Lena over a long phone call that Lena relayed to me afterward, I realized I'd spent 38 years assuming his confidence meant he was usually right, and I finally understood that it just meant he was usually loud. Garrett and Theo, Lena's brothers, both distanced themselves from their father in the months that followed. Not completely, but meaningfully. Garrett told Lena, at a smaller family gathering that spring, that he'd started reconsidering a lot of things Dad had told me about people over the years, once he understood how confidently Walter had been willing to act on something that turned out to be entirely fabricated from his own assumptions. Walter attempted, several times over the following year, to reframe what had happened, describing it, in conversations with extended family, as a misunderstanding or something that got out of hand, language that Patricia's formal documentation made considerably harder to sustain once anyone actually asked to see the timeline. I have not spoken to Walter since that Sunday dinner. Lena has spoken to him exactly twice, both brief, both at her initiation, both ending without resolution. Caleb is 3 years old now. He has my father's exact ears and Lena's exact laugh, 2 facts that nobody in this family has ever needed a laboratory to confirm. We had a quiet first birthday party for him, the year after that dinner, with a small group of people who had never once doubted, for even a single afternoon, who his father was. I think about the envelope sometimes, not with anger anymore mostly, but with a specific kind of clarity about what it actually revealed. Walter had spent weeks building a case against a conclusion that was never true, and the only thing his certainty had actually proven, in the end, was how little he had ever needed evidence to begin with. The results destroyed him. They never touched me at all.